Toni Andres. So Toni is currently in their second year at the University of St. Andrews, following an undergraduate degree in classics and comparative literature. Last year, they joined a research project at the university that aims to transform academic research on climate change in the late Bronze Age into material for high school students. They're particularly interested in making academic achievements accessible for a broad audience through public engagement. And having worked with queer teens in musical and creative writing projects, their focus lies on creating new narratives in classics by giving queer minorities a space to retell them through creative performances. Just a trigger warning, the talk will contain graphic descriptions of sexual violence and explicit sexual language, but I believe that we'll repeat the trigger warning when the relevant quotes and slides come up. And the talk today is titled Trans Catullus, Reconsidering the Legacy of Reception and the Role of the Audience. And I'm just gonna leave it over to them now.
Hello, yeah, I'm just quickly gonna share my screen. Okay. I just need to make it big. How do I make it big?
Thanks so much. We can see it. Just as a note, I think with Clara's PowerPoint before, we couldn't, the pictures are taking a bit to load. So maybe I hope it's not the case with yours, because I think, sorry, Clara, we might have missed some of your pictures, but hopefully.
Well, I didn't have any images. I was just trying to be fancy.
Oh, okay, great, fantastic. Sorry, then maybe we maybe today we'll we don't have the same problem as yesterday. I'm sorry about that. Great.
Okay, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Okay, so hello. Thank you so much for this introduction. Thank you so much to all three of you for organizing this amazing conference and while bringing queer folks together. This has been such an amazing weekend, and I'm sure the next few hours will bring loads of more queer food for thought. So this is Trans Catullus. I'm going to be reading Catullus from a trans perspective, and I will focus on the way interdisciplinary approaches and public engagement can create diverse legacies of reception work through this reciprocal engagement between classics and diverse audiences. It's not going forward. There we go. Okay, sorry. So firstly, I will talk about the history of Catullus' reception. Then I'll move over to the way gender was constructed and perceived at the time of his writing. And I will finally apply the idea of camp to the way I read Catullus. So back in 2018, I want to talk about how mythology can be retold in young adult fiction. And there was this person sitting behind me who had apparently just finished reading The Song of Achilles. Madeline Miller was there as well. We talked about her yesterday. And I remember hearing him say how queer everyone seemed in antiquity. So the reason why this really stuck with me was that essentially this one narrative that Madeline Miller tells in The Song of Achilles was basically projected onto the whole of antiquity. And so this one narrative of Patroclus and Achilles is in the statement presented as the queer narrative. And this really clashed with my own experience as reading Miller's adaptation. So I could relate to Patroclus and Achilles to a certain extent, but a significant part of me couldn't, because it tells the story of two cis men. That doesn't make them less queer, obviously, but it's a different journey. It's a different way of being queer. So essentially, this is one of the many examples of queer readings in classical studies that are focused on cis-male homosexual narratives, and which is so nicely captured in the provisional title that you just mentioned. And this actually leads me to my second point. So this person who I just anonymously quoted came to his understanding of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers, not through reading the Iliad itself, but through Miller's adaptation. Now, the one common denominator of Catullus and Homer is the role that historical audiences played in shaping the understanding of these characters, or in Catullus's case, his poetry, even beyond classical studies, so for a public that's not necessarily affiliated with the languages. This is still Patroclus and Achilles. We've seen loads of amazing fan art in the past 2 days. I found this one on Pinterest, and you can already see the stunning difference between the vase that I just showed on the previous slide and this depiction of the two. It's much more explicit about them being lovers. And this highlights my second point about reception work quite nicely. So reception and adaptation work help making classics more accessible. Again, I didn't find this through my uni library account, but through a Pinterest account. So reception and adaptation work make them accessible for a public audience, and they encourage critical and creative exploration of these narratives. But this prevalence that I'm talking about inherently perpetuates the same power dynamics that have historically excluded other minority voices. So what I think is crucial is that classics must be made accessible in order to give space, in order to give voice to those stories who haven't been granted space, in order to change the way they're perceived in a sustainable way. And I believe that interdisciplinary approaches in combination with public engagement can achieve this. So who was Catullus? Catullus wrote his poetry in the 1st century BC, and he was already widely known and read during his active writing time in Rome. So from the very beginning, he shocked his readers with explicit and often violent descriptions of sexual experiences with both male and female partners. And I'm quickly going to announce that I will be sharing these poems that contain violent and sexual language later, but I'll let you know in advance. So Catullus then kind of vanished from the perimeter of the Roman canon for several centuries and wasn't even introduced to English-speaking audiences until 1795 by John Knott. And from Knott's translation on, interest in Catullus began to grow. So since the explicitly sexual and especially homosexual descriptions went against any societal norm at that time, his poems fell under an incredibly strict censure that altered them fundamentally. So for example, pronouns and names were changed, some lines were completely omitted. So the translations essentially were tailored towards this sterile heteronormativity of the time, and therefore went against anything the Latin poems were standing for. The translations were literally diametrically opposed to the original Latin poems. At the same time, this increasing interest in Catullus happened to coincide with the beginnings of gay rights activism in the 19th century. So several activists like John Addington Symonds and Percy Shelley wrote about homosexuality in the context of a more general rhetoric of this Roman-Greek dichotomy, with Rome being portrayed as essentially the nasty teenager. So homosexuality in Rome was, according to Shelley, for example, a sign of moral decline and people leaning into indulgence. Greeks, on the other side, practiced homosexuality as a sort of spiritual expression of their philosophical enlightenment, something pure. And as toxic and hypocritical, of course, this rhetoric is, what they essentially tried to argue for was that homosexuality was totally acceptable, which is, of course, generally a good direction. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is that this rhetoric had a major influence on how Catullus was received at this time of increasing interest in his poetry. As a Roman and as an author who wrote explicitly about homosexuality, he was the perfect example for this dichotomous rhetoric. He was essentially the stock example of a nasty teenager. And although gay rights activists publicly denounced him, research suggests that he was widely read during this time in reading circles around Oscar Wilde, for example, at the end of the 19th century. So the legacy of this development consists of two aspects. Firstly, Catullus became inextricably connected to the beginnings of gay rights liberation movements. And secondly, as a result of this, his poetry was either altered so much that it barely even contained any Catullan elements anymore, or on the other side, Catullus was looked down upon for being the indulgent homosexual that fit into the historical rhetoric. Either way, this legacy inherently locks the door to genderqueer readings of Catullus. Now, in order to understand how the gender of the lyric I and of each partner interact with each other, it's essential, I think, to look at how gender was constructed, performed, and understood at the time of Catullus' writing. And I'm heavily drawing on the works of Professor Dr. Jennifer Inglehart for this part. So generally, we have loads of statues that prove this. The Romans were notoriously fixated on the size of penises as a demonstration of power. This reflects the intrinsic connection between power and gender. Not only is power gendered, but gender imposes societal expectations of a certain performance in respect to power on the person. In other words, that means that power was intrinsically considered masculine, and vice versa, masculinity was expected to be performed through the display of power. And since gender was seen as a strictly binary system, femininity, by contrast, worked as a complementary to the masculine. So submissiveness, overt emotionality, and weakness were inherently considered feminine, and people who were female-signed at birth were expected to act accordingly. For cis men, this meant that sexual acts between two men didn't necessarily mean a loss of their masculinity, as long as one stayed quite literally the top one. So exerting power meant, in its most radical and literal form, the penetration of another body. While some extent of affection was also seen as male virtus, overt emotionality and longing was seen as the man being dependent on his partner and therefore not masculine anymore. The performance of power was therefore a fundamental part of expressing one's own gender, for men at least. Sexuality for cis men could either be affirming or subverting their social positions. And I'm going to give a trigger warning now for the next part. I will be sharing parts of Catullus' poetry now, which contain strong sexual and violent references in language. I will announce once I'm moved over to the next slides, so please feel free to look away from your screen. When we look at Catullus' poetry, the way that the lyric I performs power and sexuality is, I think, strikingly non-conforming. I'll just briefly add that I will use they, them pronouns for the lyric I and he, him pronouns when I talk about the author Catullus. There's a whole debate going on about the distinction between the poet and the persona, but I'll not dive into that now. I will also look at the lyric I as one constant entity throughout the corpus of Catullus. Now, what's so fascinating to me is that this lyric I transitions so swiftly between presenting hypermasculine and being in soft princess mode, as my flatmate put it when I read poem 5 to her, and I just really like that description. So thanks to her. I'm using Russ Cavani's 2018 translations in my presentation. They're not the closest to the Latin, but I believe that they capture the essence of each poem and the language very nicely, and the language is also very accessible. My first language is not English, so I really know what despairing over both the Latin and the English translation means. I'm just quickly going to go through 3 poems that I believe capture the way gender is performed very nicely. This is poem 5. You don't have to read the whole thing, so I highlighted the most important bits. Poem 5 essentially describes the lyric I being together with their lover Lesbia. And the two are juxtaposed to the world represented by moaning old men, and they're completely bubbled up in their paradise of love. The poem actually bubbles over with emotionality and affection. For example, the lyric I says, "Your kisses on my lips, 1,000 drops, 200 more, and then 1,000 more, 100 next. They never get to bore. Each kiss is perfect, and it never stops." And this poem is, so it's not exactly innocent, but it's utterly romantic. And this is strongly contrasted by poem 16, which I'm not going to read out loud. It's one of Catullus' most notorious poems, and literally it seems like from another realm. Not only the language is obscene, but sexuality is used for brutal punishment. It's exactly this hyper-masculine obsession with penetration as a means to demonstrate power over someone else that aligns with this gendered expression of power. Now, these 2 poems may suggest that the lyric I showers female lovers with love, but is aggressively and toxically masculine towards male lovers. Poem 16 even suggests that the lyric I is mad for being called melancholy, which Cavani translates as Todd and Guiley as sissy. It's essentially the accusation of being effeminate, someone whose performance of power doesn't align with the societal expectations on him. And this aggressive reaction might be seen as an over-the-top performance in order to prove them wrong. But when we move on to poem 99, we find the lyric I sneaking around his lover to snatch a kiss and then being utterly sad when they see him wiping his mouth. It's such a mundane and I want to say 8th grade experience, and describes the lyric I as being emotionally very vulnerable. So the lyric I says, "You are harsh to me. Your anger is like being crucified." Love in this poem is, like in so many other love poems, even dating back to Sappho, intrinsically connected to pain and vulnerability, the sensation of feeling exposed and ashamed. The lyric I plays around with sweetness and bitterness, which N. Carson famously explores in Eros the Bittersweet, referring to Sappho's bittersweet. So the lyric I is clearly in the longing position, which again is in the ancient Roman construction of power and gender considered feminine. Now, of course, I skipped quite a lot of poems in this short introduction, but what I find so interesting is the absence of any linear or climactic transition. We start off with the lyric I being head over heels with I love a lesbia, then adopting a hyper-masculine performance, then moving over to being sad about not receiving reciprocated love from their lover Juventius. This is not even a journey, but it's kind of a constant rotation, a dance on the specter of gender performance. And these performances also vary in their extremity. So poem 16, for example, is shocking in its language, whereas other poems are more mellow and almost banal. Now, when I first started my research on gender performance in Catullus's poetry, I came upon an article by Michael Broder, whose thesis was that the Romans essentially invented the modern idea of camp. And as an example, he used poem 16. I thought the idea was brilliant, but I will come to a slightly different conclusion. Now, camp was first coined by Susan Sontag in her influential essay Notes on Camp in 1964, in which she defines camp based on 58 points that characterize camp. I just picked two that I thought are particularly relevant to Catullus. So number 8 says, camp is the vision of the world in terms of style, but a particular kind of style. It's the love of the exaggerated. And 56 says, camp taste is a kind of love for the human nature. It relishes rather than judges the little triumphs and awkward intensities of character. So most importantly, according to Sontag, camp is the performance of extremes. And while many scholars criticize Sontag for her apolitical understanding of it, this changed over time, and this development has a lot to do with the connection between camp and queerness, as Alan Perrow said that there's no camp without queer. In 1972, the sociologist Esther Newton published her book, Mother Camp, Female Impersonators in America, in which she argues that camp embraces stigmatized gender identities through this over-the-top performance. And it's for the celebration of seemingly contradictory juxtapositions that stigmatized queer identities are reclaimed. So extreme performances of normative roles are therefore a reclamation of power, and that's what makes them so beautiful. So she writes, only if it's pointed out as a joke is it camp, although there's no requirement that the jokes be gentle or friendly. A lot of camping is extremely hostile. It's almost always sarcastic, but its intent is humorous as well. Now, this sounds strikingly familiar when we look back at poem 16, this brutality and shocking force of the first line. Michael Broder's conclusion is that the author aims to point out the hypocrisies in the construction of gender in ancient Rome through this brutal and over-the-top performance. So he focuses on the sarcasm behind the performance and sees it as a political statement. I absolutely agree with this reading, but I believe that there's more to it. So queerness is always inherently political while and by being performed, being lived, but it's not a mask to put on. Being queer, and especially being trans, is an essential part of a person's identity. It's not something that a person is confronted with once or twice on a weekly or a monthly basis. It's a reality that exists every single second. Now, bearing this in mind, how I read Catullus' poems is that the lyric I adopts different gender roles throughout the corpus, performs them sometimes to an extreme extent, and by doing so, they claim all normative and non-normative gender roles. They create gender how they experience it, and they experience gender how they create it. So by performing different ways of power, they essentially invite the reader to deconstruct the connection between gender and power, and also the binary in it. And this performance, this encouragement, is of course by nature political, but it's also, and most importantly, the presentation and representation of a trans non-binary experience. And that's what I found when I first read Catullus. So after I first encountered Catullus, which was actually part of my uni degree, and I started doing some research, because I really felt the need to verbalize what I was feeling while I was reading Catullus. And I found loads of research on his portrayal of masculinity and homosexuality, but apart from Broder's analysis of camp in Catullus, which is, as I said, more focused on the political aspect, I couldn't really find anything that understood the lyric I actually as a trans narrator. And what eventually gave me the words to verbalize my experiences were texts like Sontag's and other authors who took approaches from gender studies. It was also talking with my friends and classmates what helped me figure out what these texts meant and, most importantly, what they meant to me. Now, I'm showing the fan art again that I included at the beginning of my presentation to come back to the idea of diverse audiences disrupting established legacies of reception. So Miller's adaptation, which I started my presentation with, showed me that these 2,500-year-old texts do not only tell the stories of Caesar, Cicero, and Plato, but also my experiences. And this fan art, I think, shows that someone found themselves in a way in the story of Achilles and Patroclus, so that their legacy lives on in this beautiful fan art on Pinterest. So in order to gain a representative and queer-affirming spectre in classical reception, I think it's fundamental to work interdisciplinarily, and what's even more important, I believe, in engagement with the minorities whose stories have not been told in the legacies of reception of classical studies. And especially in creative conversations, people feel most comfortable to process their emotions, feelings, thoughts, and experiences, like through fan art, poetry readings, performances, or as we talked about yesterday, fan fictions. So to wrap up, I think it's through performances and creative art that these legacies can be disrupted and changed in a sustainable and queer way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Toni. That was